Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Nature Life Online from our homes to your homes. Now, my name is Christina. I'm going to be your host for today's show, and I'm really, really excited because we're going to be talking plants that bite back, aka carnivorous plants. Now, before we start talking about these amazing organisms, let me tell you a little bit more about Nature Life. Now, these shows used to happen at the Natural History Museum in London, but since we can't be there anymore for a little bit of time, we decided to take these shows and take them to your homes. We're going to have a very special scientist joining us today to talk about this topic. And one really important thing, remember, these are live, so please send your questions and we'll try to get through as many as possible. I know that you have been already sending some questions, so be patient and we'll get through as many as possible during the show. But without any further ado, let me introduce you to Fred Ramsey, our specialist today, who will be talking about carnivorous plants. Hi, Fred.
Hi. Hello, Christina. Hello, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much for making time. And thank you so much for coming in here to talk about such exciting plants, the carnivorous plants. How are you today?
I'm not too bad at all. It's another lovely day.
It is it? It is. Now, Fred, before we start talking about carnivorous plants, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do at the Natural History Museum?
Okay, well, I guess I'm the British plant specialist at the Natural History Museum, and my day job is as the curator, the person who's looking after our herbarium specimens, so our pressed plant specimens, particularly of the British plants, ferns, and some of our historic collections. So I've actually got probably more than 1 million specimens that I have to look after.
That's a brilliant job. I really, really envy you. Now, Fred, you said that you are the specialist on British plants, and people might think a little bit, it's like, wait a minute, carnivorous plants are pretty exotic plants, but they are more common in throughout the world than we would expect, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're scattered virtually all the way around the world, but even here in Britain, we've got a little more than a dozen species of carnivorous plants living out there. Some of them quite common, so people can go out and find them. So they're not just exotics. They're not just in rainforests or strange faraway places.
And don't worry, because we're going to be telling you which ones you will see in the UK. But before, let's talk a little bit more in general about carnivorous plants, because I think when we say carnivorous plants, the image that comes straight into our heads is of that green toothy plant eating a fly. And this is a Venus flytrap, a very famous carnivorous plant, very flashy. But there are many others, aren't there?
Yeah, there are very many others. This is obviously the most. This is the pin up of the carnivorous plant world. Really, it's the most amazing plant, and you can see why people immediately realised that this plant was carnivorous before anyone even assumed any others were. Um, so this is an incredible plant, but quite a rare one, and in many ways it's not very representative of the other carnivorous plants who catch things in a far less dramatic fashion.
We have a wide variety of carnivorous plants. So there's not only that one. We've got a few pictures of them. They're beautiful, I must say.
Well, that's the thing. They are glorious. Both the flowers and the foliage can be really attractive, and you can see here various, as you say, various very different sorts of structures, which these plants have evolved to attract and catch and then kill and make the most of the prey that they've caught. And they can do that in various ways. But there are sort of two main sorts of capture. There's the very active capture, or there's a much more passive capture, and the simplest of those are things like the pitfall traps, where things just fall in, drown, and are then absorbed. Whereas the others, all the way up to the Venus Flytrap, which is the most active of any of the plants. Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about those different strategies that they have to capture the prey. But if it's not the teeth, what makes a carnivorous plant? What is a carnivorous plant then? What makes a carnivorous plant carnivorous?
Well, I guess many plants inadvertently catch animals. They get sort of caught on them, or they fall into little sort of areas on the plant where moisture can collect. And I guess that's possibly how these things have initially evolved. But carnivorous plants are I guess are defined by the fact that they attract, kill, and then exploit the residues of that sort of kill for their benefits. And they do that, as we've seen, in very many different ways. And they're doing that to supplement what every plant gets through photosynthesis.
That was my next question, Fred. So, if plants they make all their energy using all the nutrients using the energy of the sun, why did this plant decide to start eating animals? And why is this beneficial evolutionary?
Well, if we look and see where most of these insectivorous plants are actually growing on the planet, it's in places where the soils are really low in nutrients, particularly the important ones like sort of nitrogen, phosphorus, and it's a good way to supplement these very meager sort of nutritional sort of quantities that they're getting from these poor soils is to catch and eat the animals which are there, and that gives them the chance just to have a slightly competitive advantage over those plants that can't do this. And you know, through evolution, through time, this has clearly been quite a successful strategy, because we do see these plants throughout the world, as I say, in these areas where the soils are very poor.
And Fred, we already have some really cool questions coming from our audience. And one of them is really interesting. Would these plants die without any insects if they can't eat any animals?
I think it's fair to say that probably they would all survive even if they couldn't catch anything, because they can make what they need through photosynthesis. It just means it's the difference between getting by and really doing well. If you've got a big feed of flies, then suddenly you really can do. So they won't die without. And if people do grow them, then they should bear that in mind. They don't need to find food for them. They will survive.
And another good question from our audience is, how long have carnivorous plants been around? And do we have any fossilized specimens?
I don't know of any fossil specimens. You can imagine you've got these structures which are quite, they're not the sorts of things which would fossilize easily. They're very sort of soft structures, and even with the leaf forms, which might give you a hint, I guess we don't have that many really good fossil specimens. So it is speculation really as to how long they have been with us. The fact that we see these different forms developing at different times, probably because they're in different lineages throughout the sort of the scope of the whole scope of plant evolution, lots of different families. It does mean that they're likely to have been, some of them have been with us for many millions of years, but we don't really know exactly when this strategy really took off.
Big questions over there, I suppose. Fred, another question that is coming through a lot, and I think we should get it out of the way. But can carnivorous plants hurt humans? And one specific question is, do they bite? Does it hurt when they bite humans?
Of course, the only thing that's really got sort of much of a bite would be a Venus flytrap, and certainly it wouldn't give us any trouble at all. We could just pull the leaf to pieces. The things that these things are attacking and killing tend to be really small insects, or even more microscopic than that. So they're absolutely no trouble to us. They won't harm us in any way, shape, or form.
There you go. I think now we can look at them in a different way in case we were a little bit scared of them. So I think that leads quite nicely into talking about how do they capture the prey, because plants, initially, as far as we know, they can move. They have to stay still in the same place where they start growing. How do they do to get through capturing the prey?
Well, they do it in various different ways. First of all, they've got to attract the things to them, and they do that by having quite often sort of very pretty colours. They will use sort of mottling effects so that you look like there's sort of sunlight coming through the leaves, again to confuse the insects. They'll often provide them with a nice sort of landing platform in some cases, and sticky treats. So there'll be smells, there'll be scents, there'll be a reward for coming to the plant, and then once the animal's there, then they use various techniques to sort of lure them into the area where they're going to be killed.
We're gonna have a look at all those different techniques, looking at specific plants that do it. And you were talking before, Fred, about passive methods and active methods. You said that the Venus flytrap, it closes, so that's an active method. But something, again, that's movement in a plant. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how the Venus flytrap does that, because I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's only fairly recently that we've understood how this can work, because it's so fast. I mean, the trigger, when it happens in milliseconds. So this thing is quite the fastest plant on the planet, really. And what we have here, you can see in that the main picture, you've got these lobes with the teeth around the edges. But if you look on the surface, you can see three little bristles, and they're the triggers. The plant doesn't want to set these traps off unless it's going to catch something. So it's set up such that you need to trigger more than one hair so that it won't go off accidentally, say if a raindrop falls on it or something like that.
That's clever.
So once the animal's in there, and two hairs have been touched within the space of about a second or so, then there are various sort of chemical and sort of electrical processes which go on, which cause the sort of some of the cells to sort of collapse, really. But this hinged effect at the bottom, which brings the two sides of the leaf together really rapidly. Yeah, in I say, and it's in hundredths of a second that this happens, and so it's really quite successful at catching things, because the teeth around the edges interlock, and you can see that the things get caught in there. And once they're in, they keep triggering those little hairs, which tells the plant that something's still in there. And the outer surfaces of the leaves sort of grow rather more than the inner, which pushes the leaves together, the lobes together, and they press down on the animal which is inside, bringing the little glandular structures which are on the surface, which send out the digestive enzymes onto the fly.
And then they digest the fly inside of that. I'm gonna call it mouth. Obviously, it's not a mouth. It's a developed leaf, but
Really?
in there. We've had a really good question from our viewers. Is what happens to the fly after it's been eaten? Does it spit it out, or do they poo it in any way?
Well, I mean that's a problem that they've got. I mean, once the sort of the gooey inner bits of the fly have been digested, all that you've got left is this really tough exoskeleton, so the chitin around the outside, which is a very difficult substance to try to break down. They don't try. That can get blown away once the leaf reopens. In this case, it's more difficult for things like some of the passive traps, the pitfall traps, like the pitchers, because they've got no way of emptying. There's no sort of U-bend that they can flush things round. Everything just sort of sits in there and builds up over time, and it will eventually sort of fester and go nasty. So that's why those traps they do have a sort of a finite life. Eventually, they will fill up.
Mm-hmm. Even the Venus flytraps, they can close and open many, many times, can they?
No, each time they do it, the process involves them sort of growing again to reopen, and that will exhaust the plant over. So each leaf trap probably has a sort of a lifespan of sort of 3 or 4 closures before it's exhausted.
Mm-hmm. So that's why
So
it's really important, if anyone has one in their homes, to not be tempted to touch the little
I
hairs.
know it's a terrible temptation. Yeah, but it's probably best not to. And let it do it for itself and capture things. Otherwise, it will sort of wear out each leaf in the end. Yeah.
Now, Fred, we've already said that we were going to talk about UK carnivorous plants. Sadly, the flytrap, we can't find it here, but we have a very cool one that maybe people have not noticed ever before. Very cool, active carnivorous plant in the UK. I really love it because it actually grows in water. Is the bladderworts.
That's right. We've got, I think, about sort of 6 species of these. They've got the really attractive sort of bright yellow or pale lemon yellow flowers, which are like sort of bit snapdragon shaped, which are held well above the surface of the water. So the pollinators are going to be nowhere near the trapping mechanisms, because the whole plant is just fairly free floating and is underwater. And it's got these very finely divided leaves. And on those, you see these little tiny lobster pot, almost like traps. And these, like the Venus flytrap, are triggered by little trigger hairs, and they're catching things like Daphnia, so little water fleas, microscopic life, swimming past these plants. If they touch those trigger hairs, it causes the lid of this trap to hinge in, and inside the trap they sort of build up a little bit of a vacuum. So when it's triggered, the water gets sucked in, bringing the water flea with it, and the water flea is almost the same sort of size of the trap. And inside the trap, we have these glandular hairs, which are then used to sort of secrete the digestive enzymes and absorb the goodies which come from what's broken down.
That's an amazingly detailed mechanism, isn't it? It's beautiful.
It's astonishing to think how such a complicated structure has evolved. Where has that come from? But it is the most amazing mechanism, and it's just a fact that it's so microscopically small and tucked away underwater that we don't really notice it and don't see it. But it's astonishing to think they're out there. Yes.
They're really beautiful. Now, we've seen a couple of really good examples of active mechanisms, but there's also plants that just kind of like wait and get the insects come to them, as you said before, attack them in different ways. And some of them are some of the ones that we can see as well in the UK, apart from the bladderworts. And there's other pitcher plants. You mentioned that before, because they are quite eye-catching as well, aren't they?
Yes, I mean these are plants that we don't naturally have in Britain or Europe. They're much more sort of, in many cases, in North America. Very many species of Sarracenia and the cobra lily darlingtonia, but also in the tropics in Asia we have the Nepenthes, the sort of the monkey cups, which we see at the top there, where the trapping mechanisms are on tendrils, pitchers formed on tendrils at the ends of the leaves. And although these plants aren't closely related, they've come up with similar sorts of ways of catching animals, which just involves really a pitfall trap. So you've got effectively a sort of a vase full of digestive fluid that you're luring things to, and then causing them to slip and fall into, and they're broken down and absorbed. You can see all of these have got little sort of lids to the pictures as well, and that helps because it stops rainfall and other things getting in and diluting the fluid inside or causing them to overflow, and also helps sort of keep the flies in as well, and lure them with these different colors and textures.
And how do they digest the insects then, Fred? Is it a little bit like a human stomach or an animal stomach, or slightly different?
Yeah, I mean, the very simplest things, there's just a sort of the natural breakdown product as things sort of slowly mold away virtually in there. But most of the species have evolved sort of little glandular structures which actually give off very similar sorts of digestive enzymes to those that we would use, and they are much more efficient at breaking down the bits of animal and things which are in that gloop of soupy sort of stuff which is in these pictures.
And Fred, since we're talking about the pitcher plants, there's been a question I've been repeating as well, which is, what is the biggest carnivorous plant? And I think it's in this group, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So one of the big Nepenthes, there's a plant called Nepenthes Raja, which has got the most amazing sort of shaped pitchers. They're rather like a huge toilet bowl, and they contain more than a litre of liquid.
Wow.
Which is enough to, it's big enough that you could sort of put a rugby ball all the way into the pitcher. And
That's amazing.
they have been found with sort of dead rats and rodents in them that have fallen in. Although, of course, for the most part, it's just insects these things are catching. So people really shouldn't worry about carnivorous plants. They're not going to hurt you. It's just really, if you're a fly, you've got a problem. But otherwise, they're just things to be admired and enjoyed.
I'm glad that you said that, because I think we've got a lot of our younger viewers saying, "Are they dangerous for humans? Can they actually hurt us?" But really can't at all.
No, I mean, and I know sometimes when we've done Nature Lives at the museum, people have been very worried about how long would I need to leave my finger there for it to digest me. It's not that strong. It really isn't something to worry about.
That's brilliant. So don't worry, they won't hurt you. They're just beautiful plants.
They really won't hurt.
To be admired and to be studied. Exactly. And actually, we had another interesting question from our audiences. Have any insects developed any mechanisms to poison the plant or survive the plant?
I mean, there are very many animals which live in and around the pitchers, so they've sort of co-evolved with them. Whether it be some amphibians that use them,
Oh, clever.
or other things which have come up with different ways of coping with that, and some things which sort of live in there and steal the prey before the plant ever gets it. I can't think of any insects which have evolved methods of poisoning the plants, but obviously the plants do get fed upon by various things, whether it be slugs and snails or other things. If you do grow them, you often find that they've got scale insects or green fly or other things on them, so they're not immune to being attacked by animals.
Okay, so they also have some predators themselves as well that they can. Fred, I also think that there's a few people watching who have their own carnivorous plants or might have had them in the past and they have died. So maybe we can talk about a little bit about that later. But we have a great question, which is, if I put a plant in my home, would it eat the flies? Would it help with a fly problem?
I think that they are a really good sort of green way of dealing with blue bottles and things like that. I think the some of the North American Sarracenias, the pitcher plants, are the easiest things to grow, keep alive. They're quite attractive, and they do mop up a lot of insects. They catch a lot, so I think they'd be the things to think about. If you've got a nice, well lit sort of window ledge where you can put a little sort of tray of rainwater down and the plant in there, it will do quite well, I think.
Brilliant. Now, Fred, moving on from the pitcher plants, there's one kind of plants that I really want to talk about because I think they're beautiful. I think they're my favorite from the little bit that I know about carnivorous plants. And those are the sand dunes. Even the name is beautiful. They have a very cool mechanism to capture the prey. They don't bite them. They don't make them fall anywhere. They just stick to them, don't they?
That's it. The leaves are covered with these lovely little tentacles, and at the end of each tentacle, you've got this little glob of tissue, which secretes gooey stuff, which also not only glues the animal once it touches it, but also contains these digestive enzymes. And you find that also with the sundews, they do react. So they're not just sort of passive. They don't just sit there. Once the prey is on, the tentacles will grow and move to bring more to bear on the thing they've caught, and the leaves themselves will roll up to make the process of getting all of the nutrients from the prey much more efficient.
They are,
They
they're
are lovely.
stunning.
Yeah, on a day like today, just to sort of see the sunlight glistening off all of these tentacles is just absolutely amazing. They're beautiful.
An absolutely fitting name, and there's a couple of these, or a handful of them in the UK as well, aren't there?
Yes, there are three species. I mean, the commonest one was the one we saw in the bottom corner. There was Drosera rotundifolia, the round-leaved sundew. The biggest is the great sundew, which great. The leaves are only sort of 3 or 4 long, but it's a glorious thing to find. Yeah.
Mhm. And friend, one question that is coming from our audience as well is the size of the plant. So these kind of plants, except for the big Nepenthes feature plants, they tend to be quite small in general, don't they?
Yeah, I guess most of these plants are really quite small. I mean, some of these little sundews are only a centimetre or two across. Some of the
Oh,
Australian pygmy ones, and all of these plants are fairly small herbaceous plants for the most part. As you say, the Nepenthes can be bigger, sort of climbing, vining sort of plants, which have got these longer leaves with the bigger traps. But even there, they're not huge plants.
brilliant. But still, they're really striking to the eye. Even if you don't spot the small ones, the moment you see something like the Venus Flytrap or even the peach plants, they're really, really striking. And it's funny to know that scientists didn't really know that much about carnivorous plants in the past. But there's one scientist that's actually not that famous for that, but he got really interested in them, didn't he? And I'm talking about Charles Darwin, which, when we think about them, we think about its finches, its theory of evolution, but you wouldn't think that he actually loved and wrote about carnivorous plants as well, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as in so many aspects of biology, Darwin's a way up there as a sort of a leading and very early thinker about these things. And his book on insectivorous plants, which was published in 1875, was really the first proper account of this. I mean, before then, people may have sort of guessed and assumed, particularly with something like the Venus flytrap. But it was Darwin who approached this in a really sort of scientific way, and he actually grew things which he'd found close to his home in Kent, and he fed them different things. He tried to poison them with things. He looked at the reaction, particularly of sundews, which were the common things that were growing close to him, and he fed them sort of cheese and various different things, and looked at the reactions, and then documented all of this in the book, and therefore that book really is seen as the first real text looking at these plants.
The drawings are really, really beautiful, and the drawings on the book and the way that he describes everything, and it's very nice.
Yeah, it's as with all of his works, you can see the sort of the workings of his mind as he goes through and explores these things in a very detailed fashion, and there's a lot of sort of beauty, as you say, to these illustrations as well. That's why so
Um,
many of these are so very collectible.
exactly, and we've got two really good questions from our audience, right? That I think might have been documented by Darwin, actually. The first one is, how do carnivorous plants reproduce?
As with other plants, they for the most part produce seeds. They've got, as we've seen, often very pretty flowers which attract pollinators, and they reproduce that way. Some of them also reproduce by asexual means, so vegetative propagation, as a lot of plants do. So they produce little bulbils, which can help them disperse and get washed around. So in that regard, that they're just like every other sorts of plant, really.
Brilliant, and they do have beautiful flowers. We saw the one from the bladderwort over
Mm,
there.
mm.
They all do have bright flowers, and I think it's important to say that the structures that they use to capture the prey, those are not flowers, because that wouldn't work that well, right? If you're eating the animals that are pollinating you.
Yeah. It's not a good idea. It really isn't. It's not going to work too well. So they're using various different techniques. They're keeping their flowers a long way away from the bits that actually catch things. They are trying to attract different things, different sorts of things to the two different areas, to try to prevent this killing of the animals that they actually need to do something for.
And another question, Fred, is how long do they live for?
Um, Depends whether I'm trying to grow them or not, in which case they don't live very long. Um, Potentially, these things are very long lived, as with so many other herbaceous perennial plants. They can live for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Wow.
But yeah, for the most part, they've got as I said, they're usually perennial. There aren't many that I can't think of any that are annuals. So they could live a long time. They can outlive you if you look after them.
That's beautiful. Fred, going back to Darwin, he studied plants again in the UK near his house
Mm.
in an area called the Keston Bog or the Keston Common. Right, so that is outside London. It's not even that far from the city.
No, it's in the London Borough of Bromley, which I think always likes to sell itself as one of the most biodiverse of the London boroughs. Keston Common is, I think it's fair to say, it isn't the treasure it was in Darwin's time, and I'm not sure that you would find any sundews on Keston Bog these days. Although there are still, I think, 5 or 6 species of sphagnum moss on Keston, and they are doing a lot to try to keep that important bog habitat going there. But there are other places around London, not so far away, where you can still see sundews, bladderworts, and some of these other plants we've mentioned. Some of the ponds in Epping Forest have got bladderworts, and the wet heathy areas there still have sundews on, and some of the Surrey heaths, which are again are quite accessible from London, are very good for sundews.
Mhm. I think with plants in general, I think when you go for a walk, it's really important to look carefully, because the moment you look carefully, you start seeing things that you weren't expecting to see there.
I think so. Yes.
It's really, really magical. Now, Fred, we had a really sweet question from one of our younger viewers. Um,
Mm.
Ella, who is 7, she wants to know, and I want to know too, what's your favorite plant? I suppose carnivorous plant, but I'm going to ask you as well, what's your favorite plant in the world?
I'm very
Two
fickle,
questions.
and my answers will change from week to week. Certainly, in terms of carnivorous plants, I think probably my favourite is Cephalotus, which is the West Australian or the Albany pitcher plant, which I think has got the most amazing sort of little sort of moccasin-shaped pitchers. Um, it's a fascinating plant. It's fairly rare. It's restricted to this one area on the Australian coast, and it's the only member of its genus and family. So it's a very distinct lineage which has arisen, and yet it sort of shows the same sort of trapping structure that has evolved independently elsewhere. So it's a fascinating plant around. It's really cute as well.
Have you ever tried to grow this one yourself?
I have one which I haven't quite killed with me here.
Oh,
Yes, it ought to be called Lazarus. It's had a near-death experience, so it's just coming back from having dried right out and hasn't produced any little pictures yet, but I'm hoping it will.
And have you got any advice for our viewers that are watching? Maybe somebody has their own carnivorous plant. Maybe somebody like me have killed carnivorous plants in the past, or maybe they're thinking they could be a good pet during the confinement. So have you got any advice to give them?
Well, I think most of us have killed our fair share of Venus flytraps over the years, and it is always a bit of a worry how many do sort of die within a couple of weeks of being bought. It's tricky to keep them alive for years and years and years on end. Although I've got a friend who has. Um, the thing is not to let them dry out, but also when you're watering them to make sure you use rainwater if you can, because many of us, myself included, live in areas which have got really quite limey, hard water, and these plants, which are tending to grow in acid, boggy environments, really don't like that calcium. So if you can give them the sunlight, you can give them the moisture and humidity they need, and the right sort of water, then you'll stand a good chance of keeping them happy.
And as we said before, better not trigger them with our fingers. And we don't need to feed the insects to them. They'll catch them on their own.
They should catch their own, yeah.
Brilliant. I think we've touched on these before, but have they got any predators? Especially if we're trying to grow them at home, should we look out for anything that would eat the carnivorous plants?
There are sort of pests, and they won't react nicely to being covered in whitefly and green fly. So there are things like that we, as with our other house plants, we would want to try to dissuade. There are things which will bite and eat them, but generally within a house, that's less of a problem than actually out in a garden. Slugs and snails can do damage to them, particularly the young traps as they're just forming. But generally, they're fine.
And another question from Nicole on YouTube: what kind of pathologies are they susceptible to?
Well, I guess as with other plants, there are they're likely to be affected by many of the same sort of pests and things. Once the leaves are damaged, then obviously you can have problems with sort of fungi and things like that. They have the additional problem again with things like the pitcher plants, where they may be full of stuff which is slowly sort of festering, that can cause difficulties and leaves to die back. But that tends to be sort of fairly localized, so they're not generally suffering from too many things.
Brilliant. And Fred, this is a very nice question from James, who is 8, and he's asking on Facebook, are they endangered? Are there any carnivorous plants endangered?
Well, a great many of them are endangered. Obviously, they are growing in quite special habitats usually where there, as we said, where there are not many nutrients, and also quite wet habitats as well. And what we've tended to do with the planet is go out there and put lots more nutrients in the system. So there's lots more pollution. There's eutrophication, so runoff from farms and agriculture, which puts nutrients into these systems, which causes the vegetation to change. We also quite often have drained areas because we want to build on them. And so again, habitats are lost, and these special little places, special plants die out. And of course, people are really excited by carnivorous plants as well. They want to grow them, so they do get sort of taken from the wild, and that has been a very big problem with things like some of the pitcher plants in America and the Venus flytrap, because everybody wants to grow them. So the habitat loss and the predation from people picking them has caused many of them to be very, very endangered indeed.
The Venus Flytrap is one of them that we should be looking after because they are quite
I mean, it's such a unique plant, and obviously it's unlikely to become completely extinct because there are millions of them being grown every year. But in the wild, it could be lost within sort of 20 or 50 years, just through the loss of habitat.
And as well, in people trying to mean well, that I think I've heard that there's been people trying to plant carnivorous plants back in the wild, and they're taking over other environments, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, people get really excited about these things, and many people plant things out in this country with the best of intentions. They want to sort of somehow improve the wild, or put things out there which are exciting for people to see and find. That can be a real problem. Certainly, pitcher plants, North American pitcher plants, have been introduced to bogs all across the British Isles by well-meaning people. And they've done really too well in some cases. There are situations up in the Flow Country and in the Lake District where we've had to go in and take literally tons of pitcher plants off of some of our national nature reserves because they've just done too well, and they outcompete other things, and even some of our native carnivorous plants, therefore sort of are suffering, and they're eating pollinators for some of the other wild native species, which can have quite a deleterious effect as well.
So, Fred, in line to that, we had a question from Megan on YouTube asking whether carnivorous plants eat one another. So I imagine the problem is not them eating one another, but taking the territory, isn't it? And they have
that's it. Yes, that's where the competitive problem comes in. They don't eat each other, no. But I can say that there is that battle for space and light, because like every other plant, most of what they are using is going through photosynthesis. So that's the most important thing to them. So if something else comes along and blocks out all their light, then they're not going to do too well. As they're eating.
Because I think, again, from our audience, a question as well that people have asked a couple of times, even if they can eat insects, they will still photosynthesize the nutrients, and they do photosynthesis.
Yes, yeah, that is the main way that they're going to get their food is as with other plants through photosynthesis.
Brilliant. Now, Fred, we've reached the end of the show now, but I think we've covered so much. I've learned so much about carnivorous plants, and I really, really hope our audience have too. Thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge with us.
It's been my pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you. I'm going to say goodbye to you, Fred, but if you want to come to another show again, just let us know. But that's all for today. I'm going to say goodbye to you, Fred. Bye, Fred.
Yeah, bye-bye.
And as I said, we've reached the end of the show, but I'm really, really happy with all the questions that you've sent through. Really good questions as well, really, really clever. So as I did, I really hope that you learned so much about carnivorous plant and you found that they are so amazing, more amazing than we even thought they were. And the next time that you go on and about, if you go on a walk, maybe look out and see what you can find, not only carnivorous plants, but all the plants. I want to highlight that tomorrow will be Fascination of Plants Day. So it will be a good opportunity to go on a walk and see what plants you find around. Even if you are in a city, you'll see loads of plants going around. Maybe not carnivorous plants, but many, many other plants around. Now, we had a really interesting topic today, carnivorous plants, but we've got so many other things to talk about. And that's why we are doing Nature Lives on Tuesdays at 12 p.m. like today, but also on Fridays at 10:30. And in fact, next Friday the 22nd, we're going to be talking about wasps. So 10:30 next Friday, don't miss it. We'll see you there. But I'm going to wrap up and say goodbye to everyone, or at least until the next time. Bye, everyone.